Well, hey, Melanie, I just want to start and ask you the title of your new book that is coming out this month.
Well, it's called A Simple Justice: Kentucky Women Fight for the Vote. And it's based off a quote by Josephine Henry, where she points out that giving women their equal rights was a simple justice. But I used the title because I liked that phrase, because as much as it suggests that giving women the vote was just a basic equality and something that seemed to be a no-brainer. Actually, it was incredibly controversial, a difficult, a movement that lasted over 70 years. And white suffragists, even as they were calling for a simple justice for themselves, in a lot of cases didn't like to flip that around and see what that would mean for Black women. So a simple justice plays on the fact that this was in no way
Nothing simple about it. And the
simple. Right.
more I learn, the more I realize, and I think you even said it was messy. And we're
Yeah.
going to get to that coming up in just a little bit. But I'd be remiss if I don't at least start by asking you the current history that is underway. And for those of us with this centennial, Kamala Harris, vice president elect, obviously alluded to all of that history, wore white in honor of suffragists this past weekend. Your thoughts as you were witnessing that history and the shattering of a glass ceiling that, boy, has been a lot of glass for us, right?
Yeah, yeah. And as you pointed out, Rachel, this perhaps the greatest celebration of suffragist legacy here. To have this barrier broken in 2020 seems to be symbolically important. And Kamala Harris dressing in white, referencing the history. I was sitting there watching it with my children, as I know a lot of people were. And a lot of people were able to say, look, there's someone up there that looks like us, and for women of color particularly. And, for me as a historian, I recognize how long that took in coming and the contributions of so many people to make that happen, because Kamala Harris has a line of women behind her who were trying to break that barrier. And so, in thinking about that, I want to also pay tribute to other women who came before her, Shirley Chisholm, Charlotta
Right.
Bass, all these women that made that possible.
Why do you think it has taken us so long? I mean, well, first of all, we know the story of suffrage, but not the full story of suffrage. And we really, even the story of suffrage, don't know, I mean, as much as we should about it. And I was embarrassed by myself, even in learning some of these names, going, why and how did I not know this? How did I not know this name? And then when you get to the fuller story of women of color, how long it took for their stories to get out. Do you think that this year is pivotal that we know A, the story of suffrage, B, the fuller story with women of color?
Yeah, I think that's going to be an important contribution that, we went into this year, a lot of people, and you've been part of these efforts, Rachel, over 5 years, we've been anticipating this moment. And we started out talking about or celebrating. We were going to celebrate in 2020. And it's turned more to a commemoration, because the more we've gone back and looked at the story carefully, the more we recognize what was left undone in 1920. And so I think there has been a really sincere effort on a lot of people's parts to better understand this movement and in all of both the victories and the defeats that it symbolizes.
Right. As we always say, warts and all. I mean, it is what it is, and you learn from it, and you hope to do better in the future, and you learn by your mistakes, and you
Yeah.
grow from it. So I know that that's a big part of it. One thing I wanted to ask you, if you had a word to describe the women's suffrage movement, because what I was stunned by too is many of the names we did know, they never got the chance to vote. I mean, they just fought for the right, but never, they died before they even got a chance to do it. And that struck me, that these women really were pushing for something bigger than themselves. If you had to describe, I mean, persistence is one word that comes to mind that we hear. Is there something else, though, that you would think?
Yeah, tenacious is the one that I immediately thought of. Undaunted, just a willingness to go in every single legislative session and push for the same bills that they had been pushing for a decade or more, and knowing that it was likely not to happen even this time around, but building the foundation for later victories. And you're right, it was in a lot of cases, women who were never going to take advantage of these rights themselves. I think of Susan Look Avery, who was in her 80s when she starts, maybe she was in her 70s, but she was an older woman, widowed, and she could have just taken it easy for the rest of her
Right.
life. And she, I mean, not just suffrage, but other causes as well. And she speaks out against racism in a very bold way. But I think probably in her mind, she knew this was a fight for the future. This was for
Right.
future generations, that it wasn't going to benefit herself necessarily.
Yeah, the unselfishness of these women really was incredible. I mean, that's the one thing that I take away going, you think it's bigger than them. They knew it. They knew they would never get the chance to vote, but yet they persisted. They were the tenacious ones. Well, let me ask you about your book, because one of the women you focus on is Laura Clay. And I read one of the excerpts, and I was so fascinated by the juxtaposition of this woman who supported suffrage her whole life, but then in the end, there was a flip. So tell us about Laura Clay and why she fascinated you.
Well, Laura Clay is synonymous with Kentucky suffrage. She came from a very well-known, influential family, not Henry Clay's branch of the family, Cassius Clay, but her father, infamous and well-known. And she and her mother and sisters become interested in suffrage after her father divorces her mother. And Laura Clay is going to lead the Kentucky movement from the 1880s until its end, and out there very much in front of the movement, not just in Kentucky, but across the South as well. But that was part of that twist you mentioned. Laura Clay supported suffrage. She believed absolutely that women should get the right to vote. But the question was how. And when it came down to women winning the vote through a federal amendment, Laura Clay backs away. She resigns from the organization she created in Kentucky, the Kentucky Equal Rights Association. She resigns her positions to form a separate suffrage organization that only supported a state amendment. And for her, it was a very important distinction how that vote came about. If the federal government granted it, the federal government then also would have the power to intervene in a state's election process. In her mind, it would be reopening the wounds of the 15th Amendment, the dreaded 15th Amendment for many Southerners. They just thought that had been a terrible thing. And so Laura Clay, when it finally is clear that suffrage, if it's going to be won, is going to be won through a federal amendment, she doesn't want any part of it, and she leaves the movement and actually advocates and organizes for anti-suffrage to have the amendment go down in defeat.
Well, and what was so fascinating to me, so she ends up, because of course Tennessee ends up being ground zero with the last state to pass. She shows up at the Hermitage Hotel where all of the women were gathering, sees people who were her once allies passing them in the hall, and they all look the other way. I mean, I was fascinated by how that all played out in this woman who believed in it in her whole life, only at the end to be against it because of how it would play out. I mean, did you get inside of her head and how she rectified that? And I mean, that's just,
Yeah.
I was jaw dropped.
Yeah, I love to contemplate that moment where suffragists and Laura Clay and her anti-allies now are meeting in the hallways, and they all say, we just kind of politely looked the other way. But Laura Clay, she provided a really interesting entry point for my story, because that's where the story starts, is her in Tennessee lobbying against the amendment. And then I go back and I try and understand this, because
Right.
when you look at it, it isn't, I mean, it's still shocking in a lot of ways to me, but it's more understandable.
When you
And I
go
think
back.
race, yeah, when you
Mhm.
backtrack. And so I spend most of the book doing this, but race is an important factor. I think even just her legacy and how she saw herself as a leader of the Southern suffrage movement, and and Southern suffragists, a lot of them, more than Laura Clay herself, see a federal amendment as kind of the end of the world. This was going to be a terrible thing. And Laura Clay, though, in her position as a leader of those Southern suffragists, and her desire to protect what she had built. She'd worked for suffrage her entire life, and now it was going to come to an end. And I think sometimes we do like to hold on to things that are important to us, and we have trouble seeing what the next stage will be. And I think she was kind of having some second thoughts about the end.
Right. Tell us who else we can look forward to hearing about and getting to know in your book.
Well, Madeline McDowell Breckinridge, for sure, who was Laura Clay's handpicked successor as the leader of the Kentucky Equal Rights Association. And Madeline McDowell Breckinridge, and just an amazing progressive reformer. I mean, she was so, her heart was for the people of Lexington, for the people of her state. And she gave so much of herself to suffrage and many other causes. So Madeline McDowell Breckinridge shows up there trying to finesse as Laura Clay's leaving the movement. Madeline McDowell Breckinridge kind of shepherding it to the finish line. You have women like Josephine Henry. She's a great story.
Well,
And
property rights, right? I
yes,
mean, that's her main thing that I think of, thanks to her.
property rights. And she is going to be as influential as Laura Clay, I would say, at the beginning of the movement. But she and Laura Clay part ways over some matters. And one of them is that Josephine Henry declares herself as an atheist. And that doesn't go over very well in Kentucky's more conservative suffrage movement.
One thing that I thought was interesting, and we'll go back to, because one of the takeaways I thought, when women and not just women, when anyone reads your book, what do you think the takeaway is on this? One thing that I do keep coming back to, it was a messy process. And I don't know if that's the takeaway, but that's one takeaway I have. When you look back at this, the struggle, the inner turmoil, everything that, I mean, it's not like it was a group of women who were all on the same page,
Yeah.
different interests, different everything. Is that part of the takeaway?
Yeah, and I mean, I think it says a lot for our politics today as we negotiate. Democracy is messy. You have people with, coming from different racial groups and ethnic backgrounds and class status, age, all of these factors. We talk about intersectionality. I think by looking at a movement like suffrage, which in our minds seems so basic, give women the right to vote, who can argue with that? But when you look at how all of these factors join in, religion is really important. Where you stand on alcohol and prohibition in Kentucky, that was a really critical factor as well. All of these things are intersecting in ways that help us then to understand our own position and our own responsibilities as citizens, and our own blind spots, because we can tend to look at the world as it seems obvious to us through our eyes. And looking at the disagreements that suffragists had remind us then that we also, I come to the table with certain expectations and assumptions.
Right, we all do. And tell us a little bit about your work, background, UK.
Mhm.
So history and women, certainly a big interest of yours.
Yeah. I teach U.S. 20th century history. I teach a lot of Kentucky, Appalachia. My first book was actually a healthcare topic on Mary Breckinridge and the Frontier Nursing Service, but women and reform were an important part of that as well. So I like to understand women, especially at the turn of the 20th century, who their horizons were expanding, but they still had these barriers in place, the expectation that a woman was to be a wife and a mother, and watching women as they tried to negotiate their interests and their goals with their obligations, or they wanted to have a family and a career. I can
Right.
have that. Looking at women who couldn't have that, to me, is fascinating to see what they did with those constraints.
And one thing that I keep, you can't be what you can't see. I keep hearing a lot of people say that, especially with Kamala Harris. And it is true, like you said, a career and a family. And looking at that, I'm curious with your young female students now at UK, their thoughts and what you've seen as far as I guess, movement that we've made. I mean, do young women come in today and go, "What the heck? It took how long?" I mean, I'm sure some of it now, it's like, "What do you mean it took this long? What are you talking about?"
Well, and in a similar way, you say the word feminist and they kind of bristle. And that makes me then kind of bristle to see them take for granted some of these advancements. But at the same time, I think what a wonderful thing it is that we can take this for granted, that we can look back and say, oh, well, that seems like ancient history,
It's not ancient
Yeah, it's
history.
not. Yeah, especially when you start tracking and they're like, oh, well, my grandmother, oh, wait, that didn't happen that long ago. Yeah, I see them do that all the time. What was really interesting to me, Laura Clay at the end of the movement, someone said to her, I think it was her or Madeline McDowell Breckinridge, they said, are you troubled by the fact that young women, and this is in the 1920s, seem to have forgotten the struggle? And she points out, I kind of did the same thing with abolition. My generation, it's something that I think is natural, a
It
natural
just
part of
is.
the process. But as a historian, that's where I get to open eyes and I get to show them it wasn't that long ago.
Right.
And look at everything here that went into giving you what you now can take for granted. Isn't that worth celebrating? And students, I mean, I think history is powerful. They like
No, I agree. And I think back even in the profession that I used to be in broadcasting and journalism, how it just changed in the time that I was in it for women and advancements. And I'm sure the same thing in your field. You want to say to young people, no, trust me, don't take anything for granted. We've had to fight for everything, kind of
Yes.
deal. Let me ask you one other thing I want to end with is public art, because we are seeing some progression with that. And certainly in Lexington, with what you all have to be proud of with Stan. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, Stand was an initiative. Kathy Ploman and Jennifer Massotti, two council members, were just struck one day. I think it was Jennifer Massotti who first noticed there is no public art dedicated to women in Lexington. And I mean, we've got a lot of men and horses, and there's even a camel, a statue of a camel, nothing for women. And they decided that was a problem that they needed to fix. And went out there and raised $500,000, uh, put it out for bid, and a wonderful piece of art now standing in downtown Lexington in front of the very well-known signature, I call it the flip top garbage can building. So in a very noticeable spot. And the five women, the figures that stand there represent suffragists, and they are tall. They are extremely tall and catch your attention and really send a great message to the city.
I do want to end with the one thing you said, though. You said if you go, make sure you come at night, right?
Right.
To see
Yes.
that.
Yeah, they light up, and that I think is even more, it kind of makes me catch my breath, and hopefully others
Absolutely.
too.
Well, and I wonder, we've talked so much that so much has been canceled this year just because of COVID, the pandemic. But in the end, 2020 certainly will be a year to remember for women, and all we've learned this year, despite the pandemic, the education has gone on about suffrage. What is your takeaway of 2020 and this commemoration?
I would encourage people to really educate yourself, to do some reading. There are wonderful books that are coming out right now. Martha S. Jones has written a book looking at women of African American women and their history. Kathleen Cahill has looked at a variety of different women of ethnic and racial backgrounds and what they contributed to the suffrage movement. There's a whole crop of books that have come onto the scene this year. And I would encourage people to pick up some of those and really dig into a story. Maybe you think I've heard of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. Well, there's a lot more to the story, and a lot of good reading right now.
You bet. More to the story, including your book.
Oh, yeah.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rachel. Good to talk to you.
You too.